is one of the original names of Portland? Stumptown. Who here can guess why it was called Stumptown? Because of all the stumps. Because naming things have always been hard. So yes, it was called Stumptown because we had a lot of trees, and then we had a lot of logging. And in fact, one of the quintessential images that comes to mind of the Pacific Northwest is that of a lumberjack. A big, strapping man with burly chest hair and flannel dripping off him and an axe, and don't want to mess with him. Well, except one thing. There is one thing that lumberjacks fear above all else, and that thing is our next speaker. A gumbaroo. Gumbaroos live in hollowed-out tree trunks, large and ferocious. They appear like hairless bears with black, thick skin. And they are eating machines, eating everything in their path, consuming whole horses in a matter of minutes. And no animal dare mess with a gumbaroo because they can't penetrate its thick, rubber-like skin. In fact, there is only one known way to kill a gumbaroo, and that is with fire. In fact, lumberjacks and firefighters have heard the sounds of explosions during forest fires, and then the hint of rubber on the air as the extremely combustible gumbaroos explode when they come into contact with flames. So please, put your candles away and your hands together for Dawn Parzych.
All right, hello, thank you everyone. A little bit more about me, other than I explode when exposed to fire, is I'm the Director of Product and Marketing at Catchpoint. I have both a bachelor's and a master's degree in psychology. My first job out of college was as a special education teacher, and I'm an amateur photographer, all of which makes me highly qualified to be speaking here with you today. While all of these things are interesting, yes or no, about me, they don't really help you to understand, as a DevOps audience, who I am and what I can provide to you, what value I can provide to you. And the same can be said for probably a lot of the metrics that your organization is capturing today. They're interesting. We like to report and talk about them, but what are they really telling us? Why do these matter? So we're going to dive into that a little bit deeper today. So how many metrics does your organization capture today? Who here says maybe 100? No one? 100? 500? Thousands? Tens of thousands? Yeah, the numbers, yeah. We capture so many metrics. And why are we capturing these metrics? We capture them to understand, to share, to judge success or failure. We look at trying to find anomalies with the data or predict what we're doing now and where things are going in the future. And I'm sure some of you in the audience may have metrics that you look at and you're like, I'm not really sure why we collect and report on this metric, but we've been doing it forever. We were collecting it since before I was here, so it must be important, so we'll continue to report on it. Who here has a metric like that, or has a friend that has a metric like that? Metrics need to tell us whether we're heading in the right direction. If they're telling us you're moving in the wrong direction, that's important to know as well. If you don't know why a metric's being collected, figure it out, and then decide if you still need to collect that metric. The problem with metrics is they can be very, very dangerous. If you don't understand what the metric is telling you, if you think it's measuring one thing and it's really measuring something else, that's not good. If you decide you're going to be measured and bonused on a metric, you start gaming that metric. If you can game a metric, that's not any good either. They have to be meaningful. They have to work towards a common goal. If your measurement is at odds with another team's measurement, or if it's at odds with an organizational goal or objective, That's not good. We want to make sure all the metrics that an individual, a team, are all aligned towards an overall organizational goal. Oftentimes, we want to measure something, but we don't know how to capture that data. Years ago, I was talking to a customer. We were about to start a proof of concept and trying to figure out what metrics would determine success or failure of that project. And so I asked him, what are you trying to achieve? What do you want? And he responded, I want my customers to be happy. And I was like, well, that's great, but how do you measure happiness? We couldn't measure that. That wasn't something that we could measure. So we had to try to figure out other ways that we could measure what would make those users happy. In the end, we came up with some metrics, but it wasn't necessarily tied to exactly what he wanted. He measured what he could, not what he wanted to measure. And because of these, we call some of these proxy metrics, where it's like I'm going to try to measure this and correlate it to this other factor. It also leads to what's called vanity metrics. And these, to me, are some of the most dangerous metrics out there. Because vanity metrics are those metrics where you feel great. The metric's improving, we're growing, we're successful. But it doesn't tell us if we're growing in the right direction. The most famous vanity metric ever was produced by McDonald's. McDonald's measures billions served. Billions of what? Billions of people? Billions of hamburgers. When did that metric start? When did it end? How has it grown? How has it changed? Recently, that number would probably be going down, but all they're measuring is how that metric has increased year over year over year. So it's really not showing much, but it makes them feel really good and popular because they've served billions and billions of people. You want to pay attention when you start hearing about metrics that you're like, oh yeah, this is good. But if all you're doing is like, yeah, this is good, that's not actionable. You need to understand if something goes wrong with that metric, if it starts to do something you don't expect, what action can be taken from it? A lot of organizations will focus on daily active users if they're a SaaS-based organization. Great metric, complete vanity. But it's what a lot of executives look at, it's what a lot of shareholders look at. But if all you're doing is tracking the daily average users, you may miss other changes. This is a chart from a company that played songs. You could log in, listen to music. They reported on daily active users, and it was great. It went up and up and up. But what they missed was while their daily active users were going up, the number of songs that people were playing where they made the most money, that number started going down. Because they were focused on this vanity metric, they had no idea that they were losing money, that they weren't successful. Focus on the metrics that matter as opposed to the ones that make you feel really good. All metrics have consequences. Some are positive, some are negative. And even if it's a negative consequence, you still can take action. What happens if you set a goal for a metric and that goal isn't met? Do you move the goalpost? Or do you try to determine why that goal wasn't met? A lot of people will just move the goalpost. We were supposed to release by March 1st. Oh, that deadline's passed, so we'll push the release date out 2 months. But is it really good just to move that goalpost without understanding what caused the delays? What happens when a goal isn't met? Do people get fired? Are bonuses lost? Do people leave? Do you lose employee productivity? Or in the worst possible scenario, does a company go out of business because they weren't tracking the right metrics? Look at what the consequences are of the metrics that you're capturing. Earlier this morning, we heard a little bit about an author called Nassim Taleb. Another book that he wrote that I am a big fan of, again, not an easy read in the least, is The Black Swan. he talks in The Black Swan about outliers and how we need to focus on outliers and not a specific item. Just because something has never existed or you've never seen it, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. A black swan, nobody ever thought black swans existed because nobody had ever seen one. But black swans do exist. They're just very, very rare. So being able to identify an extreme outlier, when you're looking at metrics, instead of saying, well, that was skewed by an outlier, don't discount those outliers. Look at what those outliers are, because there's probably a lot more value in the outlier than what that average or that median is showing you. We like to tell stories. During one of the Ignites yesterday, there was a discussion about like the brain and bias. And so we use stories to form what's called the narrative bias, because stories are easier for us to understand. We're able to relate to that. We can identify characters, we can identify the pain in them. They help us tell a larger story and explain why things happen. If bounce rate goes up on a certain page, what caused that? Is it because the content's bad? Is it because the page performance wasn't right? Or is it just because people wanted to come in, get a piece of information, they got it, and they left? There's a lot of reasons why, but we try to come up with a story to explain why that bounce rate was high. Framing things as a story helps people understand. Instead of just sharing a number, instead of just sharing a metric, tell a story with the metrics, tell a story with the data. It'll help you get buy-in from people, even if they don't quite understand why that metric is important to you. Thinking is very hard. We are bombarded with information. We have way too much information, and often we don't have enough time to process and look at that information. And if we do, some of the information's out of context. And if all of those are working well, you only have finite space. You can't add more storage to your brain. You can't add another array. You can only remember so much. So we simplify what we're trying to look at and trying to remember so that we're able to process information faster. So the more metrics you're looking at, the harder it is. Boil things down to a couple of key metrics that are the most important because of these 4 factors. You want people to remember the salient point, not all this extraneous thing. So find like the 1 or 2 metrics that really make your point and focus on those. There are 2 systems of thinking in the brain. Daniel Kahneman wrote Thinking Fast and Slow, and he describes them very eloquently as System 1 and System 2 thinking. And System 1 thinking is automatic. You don't even have to think about it, you know the answer. What's 1 plus 1? You know that that answer is 2, very easy. But if I was to ask you what's 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5, you have to stop a little bit and think about what that answer is. That's System 2 thinking. It's easy to do, but it's not a knee-jerk reaction. It's a fascinating phenomenon when you're looking at like simple tasks like addition. One of the studies that Kahneman did is he asked people to sum the numbers between 1 and 10 and just quickly estimate. You can't take a lot of time, just what's that total? And if he presented the numbers in ascending order versus descending order, he got 2 very different answers. People that were presented the numbers in ascending order estimated lower because they started with smaller numbers to begin with. People that were presenting the list in descending order estimated it higher because they were presented with higher numbers to start with. So your brain builds in these ways to kind of look at information and process it. Because we don't want to spend a lot of time thinking. We don't want to spend time in that system 2 part of our brain. We want to spend it in the system 1. So we have to look at how we present the data. If you're trying to build up to this huge crescendo and like, I'm going to show you this piece of data and then this piece of data, people remember the first piece of information that they see. You can present 5 different pieces with that most important piece at the end. They're going to remember the first thing you said. So make that first thing you say the most important, that takeaway that you want them to have. There are qualities to good metrics. Not every metric is a bad metric, and not every metric is a good metric. You want to take a look at certain things. One is looking at whether or not your metric is actionable. If the data isn't actionable, it's not useful, and it's probably not usable. And what makes something actionable? It's, I know this, what can I do to change the value of this metric? If there's nothing that can be done to change the value of the metric's not actionable. It doesn't mean you don't necessarily want to measure it, but that shouldn't be how you're trying to communicate overall progress and growth. If data is collected with a flawed methodology, probably not actionable. If the data isn't answering the right question, probably not actionable. Again, going back to that proxy metric. That proxy metric is the best approximation you can get. You might not be able to take action on it to reach your overall goals. Metrics should be simple. They could have some very complex calculation and formula used to drive them. That's okay, but when you're explaining it to others, remember that thinking is hard, and people like stories. The easier you can make that metric for people to understand, the more likely it will be to be remembered. Data needs to be comparable. You want to know how you're trending over time. How was this metric last month, last year? How is this compared to competitors? Does this show us that something is wrong? If you can't compare the metric to something else, again, why is this being used to describe, how successful a team or an organization is? Focus on the comparative side of things. Metrics shouldn't be used to shame or pit one team against another team. Everybody should be working towards a common goal. And if you're using a metric to try to prove that your team is more successful than somebody else's team, is that really the goal that you're trying to make, or the point you're trying to make? Looking in like, oh, our team wrote X number of lines of code. We have X number of commits. This team only had Y number of commits. Okay, that's a comparable metric. You're comparing your teams to another team's metric. But is it really used to help create a sense of community and culture, or is it trying to show that somebody's a winner and somebody's a loser? Try to use metrics that tie your goals to other teams' goals and that are in alignment, not combative. Visualization of data is another critical step. It's great to report on means. It's something that's easy to remember. But a mean doesn't tell you everything. This is 2 charts from a series that Autodesk created, where they have 13 different visualizations. All of these visualizations show the same mean and standard deviation. There's actually 4 metrics that are identical based on this. So don't just share a data point. Don't just share a mean. Visualize the data, because sometimes when you visualize it, you're going to see things that you didn't know were in your data, like a dinosaur. A lot of people said, okay, means aren't the right number because outliers and all this other stuff. So we're going to report median instead. That's still a single data point. Still not very useful. Summary statistics in general should probably be avoided unless you're presenting visualizations. This is again a snippet of 2 charts from flowing data. They have a series of graphics that show, okay, here's a median of a statistic. But when you expand it to look at what the distribution of that metric was, it gives you a very different picture. So looking at an overall picture as opposed to a single individual summary statistic. Metrics need to be honest and relevant. Talked a little bit earlier about gaming metrics. If you can game the metric, you're probably not being very honest about that metric. If the metric moves, how is this also moving the value of the company or the team? What makes it relevant? Why do we care about this metric? And is the metric being used to achieve a goal? And is that goal achievable? Trying to set a metric and a goal and then be like, we're never ever going to meet that deadline, then rethink the goal and rethink the metric, as opposed to let's figure out how to hit that deadline. Metrics should constantly be reevaluated and reassessed. Don't just set it and forget it. Yep, collecting that data, sending a report out, everything's good. When a metric becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure for where things are. You want to always be reaching for a destination, and like once you've hit that target, where do you have to go from there? So how can we use metrics and all of this information to align ourselves, our teams, and our organizations? Your metric should only matter if it matters to the overall organization. Sure, you can sit there and say, all of these metrics matter. But ask yourself, so what? Why am I measuring this? We report on MTTR. Why do we measure MTTR? You might know for your individual team why you matter it, but for the overall organization, why does MTTR matter? Look at the funnel as we go down. So you've got metrics on culture, collaboration, and sharing. Those are great. They then vector off into 2 other areas. You're looking at efficiency and effectiveness, or quality and velocity. MTTR, I would argue, and you can argue with me afterwards, that MTTR focuses more on efficiency and effectiveness. How quickly can we resolve problems? How efficient are we? And then at the bottom of this, and this is the so what, why does MTTR matter? What is the customer and business value? If you're taking a long period of time to resolve issues, your company is losing money, your customers are upset, employee morale goes down. These are the reasons that MTTR is captured. Look at what that bottom so what is. Focus on your metric, and then how is this impacting the organization? How is this metric impacting other teams? You might have to go through multiple iterations of the so what experiment until you really come up with, okay, here is the customer and business value for it. And the hard part of that is you have to step outside of yourself to look at what matters to somebody else. It requires empathy. It requires putting yourself in somebody else's shoes to say, why does this matter to them? So phrase it from their standpoint, not from your standpoint. Metrics go up and metrics go down. You may, for a short period of time, be focused on one metric. And then 3 or 6 months later, something else happens and you need to shift focus and you need to look at a different metric instead. That's okay. Make sure you're communicating that. Make sure the metrics that you're looking at are being used to drive action and make change across the organization. Thank you. Time for questions.
We have about 5 minutes for questions.
That's what I thought. Okay. And it's really hard to see. Yes?
What's your newest metric that your team is collecting right now that you're excited about?
What's the newest metric my team is collecting that I'm excited about? My team right now is focused on converting leads. Like, so somebody reads an article, and then how many people that read an article that's written convert to like spend more time on the site or speak to us. We used to only track page views. So how many people are out reading our blogs? That's not necessarily the greatest metric. So right now we're looking at how many people are reading the blogs and what percentage of them go on to do something else on our site and then engage with sales or somebody else. So moving into something that's more actionable has been helpful for that. Over here.
I'm not sure I'm clear on what your stance is regarding mean time to resolution. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about what kind of a metric that is and why.
So what's my stance on mean time to resolution? I don't consider MTTR a vanity metric. It's very actionable because you can see, okay, if your mean time to resolution is high, there are discrete steps that can be taken to get that down. My point with MTTR is, why is that being measured? And a lot of times I'll ask people, like, why do you measure MTTR? And it's like, well, to know how quickly we resolve an incident. And it's like, that's not why you're measuring MTTR, right? It may be like from your perspective, but if you want that metric to be elevated and be used for like other organizations, if you want to share that with the sales organization, customer care, it needs to be phrased in a way that they understand. So MTTR is important to measure because if we're taking a long time to resolve incidents, customer satisfaction goes down, revenue drops. That's why MTTR is an important metric for the organization to track. You're welcome. Yes?
How do you avoid bias metrics and or if when you see and identify it, how do you resolve to make that maybe unbiased against a certain metric you're looking at?
So let me see if I can summarize. How do you avoid biased metrics? And if you do uncover bias, what can you do to resolve it? Okay. So for me, the first step is to look at and understand that everyone's biased. If somebody comes to me like, here's this really unbiased data that I have. No, everything has a bias associated with it. And it's being able to see what that bias is. A lot of time, biased metrics are being presented to answer a question that you already knew the answer to, or you think you know the answer to. So it's, I'm trying to think of an example. You go into like troubleshooting, you're like, I know what the problem is. And so you look for the data that supports what you want to say. So that's kind of your confirmation bias. So if you know going in the answer that you want and the data supports, then that's likely biased data. So trying to explore and analyze data without supposing what you know the answer and outcome is.
All right. Another round of applause for the Gumbaroo. Thank you.